Good morning. All right, we are in a series talking about having baggage in your life. And last week we talked about forgiveness. And there was a resource that I didn't neglected to talk about that was a really good resource. It's Tim Keller, who recently passed away. If any of you have ever followed him, he was a great pastor and preacher and writer. And his last book was on forgiveness. So if you want to know more about that subject, it's a terrific subject. Today, we're looking at pride and arrogance versus humility, okay, and what that all means. Now, I want to say first that I know that not all pride is bad. If you have pride in your children, you see your baby take its first step, and she says her first word, you should be proud of that. Be proud of that. You can take pride in your country, in your family. There's nothing wrong with having confidence, as long as it's marked by genuine self-denying humility. The pride I'm talking about today is arrogance, okay? It's the opposite of humility. It's talking about pride, being prideful, and you might wonder, was this topic important? I think it is. Of course, I wouldn't be talking about it. I read this book recently. It's called The Road to Character. Wonderful book by David Brooks. And in the beginning of the book, he has the first chapter. It's called Shift. And it's about this transition that he sees going on in the country today. And at the beginning of the book, he tells this story, and I'm going to read part of it. He was driving in his car, going home, and he was listening to this radio program. It was called Command Performance, where they listen to these old radio programs, and sometimes it's interesting to hear what was on in the country at that time. And this was going out to the troops in World War II, and then this particular command performance was for everyone in the country, and it was broadcast the day after VJ Day. Now, VJ Day was the victory over Japan at the end of the Second War, and so it was a great, day of celebration in our country. It was August the 5th, 1945. And on this program, it had all the famous people of the day, just about. It had Frank Sinatra singing and Betty Davis and Cary Grant and people who were, in the public eye at that time. But as he was listening to the program, he noticed that the tone of the whole program was humility. The Allies had just completed one of the noblest military victories in human history, and there was no chest beating on the program. The show opened up with Bing Crosby, who was the host, and he said this: "Well, it looks like this is it. What can you say at a time like this? You can't throw your hat in the air. That's for run-of-the-mill holidays. I guess all anybody can do is thank God it's over." And at the closing of the show, Crosby said this. He said, "Today, deep down, we have a feeling of humility." Another guy, Burgess Meredith, an old actor back then, he said, "I hope that in victory, we are more grateful than proud." Now, he sat in the driveway, listened into that radio program. Some of us do that sometimes, sit in the driveway and listen to something. And then he goes in the house and he turns on the television and there's a football game on. And immediately, quarterback threw a short pass to a wide receiver. He was tackled, a yard after he caught the ball. And the defensive player that made the tackle did what all professional football players do today, just about. A moment of personal accomplishment. And so he has a self-puffing victory dance for tackling somebody after 1 yard. And it occurred, this is what he writes. Brooks says, "It occurred to me that I just watched more self-celebration after tackling a receiver than I heard after the United States won World War II." There's some things in the past that we look back and we say, I wish we had that. And I don't know what's caused it. I wonder it has something to do with the millions and millions of selfies that people post of themselves all the time. It seems more of a glorification of yourself. That's not healthy for us, but it's normal for us. There was a series going around called The Art of Selfie, where they looked at prominent painters like Rembrandt and Van Gogh, who all took paintings of themselves. And now that you don't have to paint, you could just take a picture. There are a lot of young people says take at least 4 selfies a day. Okay, and so it's become common. Now, pride is mentioned a lot in the Bible. I want to look at a few texts about pride, and then I want to focus and then look at how you know if you have it or not, and then focus on one account of Jesus in the Bible. So, finish this sentence for me. Pride goeth before what? No. That's how we're programmed. The verse is in Proverbs 16:18. It says this: pride goeth before what? Destruction. A haughty spirit before a fall. The Bible says very strong words about pride. In fact, in the Message version of this verse, I love the way it's translated. First pride, then the crash. And I'm afraid that's what's going on in our culture right now. First pride, then the crash. The Bible warns of the dangers of this kind of arrogance, of this kind of inward focus life. Last week we talked about selfishness. This week, pride. There's another verse, Proverbs 16 to 17. It says, 6 things God hates, one more that he loathes with a passion. And the first thing that he hates is this: eyes that are arrogant. And there are many other things he says here that he hates: murder. He hates adultery. There are other things, but perhaps he puts pride first because that is the first one that leads to the others. Because you see, if you are prideful, often you don't know you're prideful. Why don't you know you're prideful? Because you're prideful. You're not even aware of it because you're so arrogant. James 4:6 says this: but God gives us more grace. He gives us more grace. That is why Scripture says God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. So this arrogant attitude that is, I think, infected our culture, and you might be thinking, wow, I wish, Jimmy was here to hear this. We have a tendency to do that. Think about it. But ways to tell. So I have some questions to ask you to go through. How do you tell if pride is a thing for you? Okay, number one, if pride is a thing for you, you take everything personally. Okay, you get defensive. You often argue for yourself. If you see 2 people talking, you assume they're talking about you, and it's not nice. You often say something like this: oh, what's that supposed to mean? What's that supposed to mean? Huh? Attitude. You take things personally. You're quick to defend, very defensive. There's a book written by Brant Hansen. It's a great book. It talks about Jesus, and it's called Unoffendable. And it talks about how Jesus never defended himself. He was comfortable being around people who didn't like him or upset at him, and he didn't defend himself. He knew who he was, he had nothing to prove, and he had this quality of humility. Second way you can know if you have a thing, if pride is one of your things, is, and you might talk to somebody else and ask these questions later, your feelings are the most reasonable. It's not just enough that you are right. You must insist that everyone else agrees that you are right. It's not okay for people to disagree with you. You constantly overestimate your own opinions. There was a survey done of literally thousands of people who were on this dating website. And they asked thousands of members on the dating website a number of questions, but one of the questions was this: are you a genius? Yes or no? Well, the men stood out in the survey. 2 out of every 5 men said, well, if you're going to corner me on this, yeah, I guess you would say, yeah, I'm a genius. statistically speaking, the number of people who should be a genius is 1 in 1,000, at least. But 2 out of 5 guys thought they were a genius. You know, that's ironic to me. Number 3, your desires are the most important. Okay, when you want something, you know, are you focused? This is something I'm guilty of, and my wife called me on it, that I would do this, okay? I would say, okay, where do y'all want to go to eat after church? And then everybody would tell me, and then we're on the way, and then I'll say, well, why don't we go to Cookout? And we go to Cookout because I'm driving. And you know, your desires seem to be the most important. You know, there's a verse in Philippians that says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourself, but we don't do that. But I will say to you that if you're married, your spouse can help you in this area. For instance, there was a husband, I heard this story, there was a husband that his wife asked him to go out and get a can of peaches. That's all he had to do. He went out to the store and it was so busy and there was long lines. And so he snuck a can of peaches and put it in his jacket pocket and walked out of the store. And he got home and he confessed to his wife that he stole the can of peaches. She was furious, and so she took him to the police station. She said, he stole a can of peaches. Well, he wound up going before the judge. Okay, he went before the judge, and judge said, okay, tell me how many, you stole the peaches. Tell me, sir, how many peaches were in that jar? And the man said, well, 6. And he said, okay, you're going to spend 6 days behind bars to teach you a lesson. His wife was sitting in the back. She raised her hand, and the judge said, yes, ma'am. And she said, he also stole a can of peas. You know, getting married should humble you. Somebody checks on you. Alistair Begg, who's a great preacher, he tells a story about driving in his car. He's a pastor, and he was driving his car with his son, who's about 12 years old, because your children can, you know, teach you too. And his child was 12 years old in the back seat, and Begg was so frustrated at driving at other drivers. And so he was talking over and over about the people driving around him. He was verbalizing something about their natures. And he said something like this, look at that clown. I mean, if you're going to make a left-hand turn, at least turn on the blinker. You're an idiot. And there was a small voice from the back seat and said, that's another kind word from your pastor. You know, so to think that you are the one that is going to be in charge and is your opinion, that's a sign. Number 4, you always think that the other person needs to apologize or change. Jesus warned about seeing the speck in the other person's eye. Matthew 7:1-6 says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. With the measure you use, we measured you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can I say to your brother, how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when all the time there is a plank in your own eye, you hypocrite? First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. You know, somebody who's like this will start off with say, well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. But if you hadn't done that, I wouldn't have done that. That's a non-apology. Number 5, you tend to be negative and critical instead of positive and grateful. You can become a negative person, and it alienates people around you because people don't want to be around somebody who's complaining negative all the time. But you look at things, you look at other people, and you're judging them, and you're complaining about them. And, you know, if you behave like this throughout your life, eventually you're going to get lonelier and lonelier. I mean, maybe your daughter-in-law is just avoiding you, and she's going to stay out of your way because she's tired of trying to make you happy. It happens in marriages. It happens with friends. They just drift away from you. The language of arrogance and complaining and criticizing is going to isolate you. 6, you keep thinking of other people that need to hear this as I'm talking today. If you're thinking, boy, I wish my mother-in-law could hear this one. You know, the tendency is to see pride in other people, but not in yourself. Obadiah 3, you don't have to have a chapter, it's only one chapter. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock and make your home on the heights, and who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? The pride of your heart has deceived you. Now, these are some examples. I want to look at a little story that Jesus tells about pridefulness. It happened, the Gospel of Mark, and James and John, 2 of his disciples, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to Jesus, and they said, "Teacher, we want you to do us a favor." And Jesus said, "What's your request?" And they said, "Well, when you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honor next to you. Reserve us a seat, Jesus. One on your right and the other on your left." And Jesus said, "You don't even know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering that I'm going to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering I must be baptized with?" And they said, "Oh, yep, we are able." And Jesus told them, "You indeed will drink from the bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God prepared those places for the ones he's chosen." Now, the other disciples, they're guilty too. When they heard that James and John had asked to be special privileged, they were indignant. And so Jesus called them together and said, "Okay, gang, this is it." And he says the same thing for us today, these same words. "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over other people." And that's the world we live in. We live in a world where people who have money get special attention. People who are famous, special attention. People who have high rank get special attention. You're in the military, somebody ranks you, you salute them, you know, and that's the way it is in the world. But it's not to be that in God's people. But among you, it'd be different. Whoever wants to be leader among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for others, from many. And so this attitude that we're to have, supposed to be with all in the church. I have a friend, Brian Williams. Some of you know Brian. He's come and taught here before. He is the over a lot of churches in this area. He's a great guy, but he told me this story. I probably shouldn't say his name, but I'm going to, because he's never going to watch this anyway. There used to be this guy who was pretty famous, Joel Gregory, okay, and he was a pastor at First Baptist at I believe Dallas, and he followed Criswell, and he had this great preaching voice. It was this great voice. Well, Brian was in school at Southwestern Seminary, and he was out in the parking lot getting ready to get in his car, and Joel Gregory pulled up in his car, and he said, "Son, could you give me a hand here? I need to go to the airport. I'm flying out. I need somebody to drive me to the airport and then drive my car back." And Joel said, "Oh, yes, sir, I'll help you." And he dropped what he was doing. Probably Brian was thinking, I get to spend some time with this great godly person. Okay, so he got in the car with Dr. Gregory, and immediately Joel Gregory put in a cassette tape, back then they had cassettes, of his own sermon. And for the whole car drive, he listened to his own sermon and laughed at his own jokes while he was riding with Brian to the airport. And then Brian dropped him off. Not really a word was said. He said, "Thank you." You know, that was it. Thank you. He drove the car back. And then the other thing that got Brian is like just 2 weeks later when he came back, Brian went to that church and he actually helped at that church, and he helped in the greeting ministry. And he said that when Joel Gregory came into the church, he introduced himself and shook his hand. And then when he left the church, he introduced himself and shook his head and said, "Hi, I'm Joel Gregory." Didn't even remember who he was. That attitude, and I'm sure I do arrogant things. We all do. It's not just for pointing fingers at other people, but we need to understand that that's not how we're supposed to be. 1 Timothy 6:17 says this: "Command those who are rich in the present world not to be arrogant, not to put their hope in wealth, which is uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment." And you might think, well, I'm not rich. That's not for me. Well, there was this illustration. I thought it was a good illustration. Okay, imagine that the entire population of the world is represented by 100 people. So there are 7 billion people on our planet, but we're going to say that's 100 people. Now, if that was the case, 70 of those 100 people on the planet would know Jesus. 30 of them would not. 51 of them would be women. 49 would be men, which is interesting because according to the numbers, it doesn't add up statistically that there's a man for every woman. There's more women. Anyway, 85 of those 100 people on the planet would not have running water or electricity. 80 of those would be malnourished, had not had enough to eat. 6 of the 100 would be from the United States, and those 6 people would account for more than half the world's wealth. Now, in many ways, we're blessed, okay? And so we're taught here that we should not use the blessings that we've been given by living in this country to think of ourselves as arrogant. That's not our attitude. Our attitude is supposed to be giving to others, Command those who are rich in the present world not to be arrogant. Now, this story I found this in an article, and I thought it was made up because it sounds made up, but check it when you get home, okay? But this was recorded in the different things. It was in Fortune magazine once. There was a guy a few years ago named Robert Kraft. He was the owner of the New England Patriots, okay? And in 2005, Robert Kraft goes to the Kremlin with some other business leaders to meet with the Vladimir Putin. Okay, I got a picture of Putin and Robert Kraft. And Kraft knew that Putin was a big sports fan, and so he thought, I bet he's never seen a Super Bowl ring. So as we were talking, he took off a Super Bowl ring and he handed it to Putin so he could see it, so he could hold it. And so Putin held it, looked at it, put it on his finger, and then he took it off his finger and put it in his bucket. And some KGB guys walked up next to him and he walked off. Now, Robert Kraft's name was on the ring. It was a Super Bowl ring. And according to the reports of this I read, the State Department, he reached out to the State Department and said, "Putin got my ring." And the State Department said, in the interest of Russian-American relations, why don't you just call it a gift? Maybe he thought it was a gift because people give him things sometimes. And don't say anything about it. And so he didn't. That happened in 2005. Well, in 2012, Kraft eventually broke his silence and told the real story. Just imagine the arrogance of Putin. That ring, I can't imagine him wearing it around the Kremlin. He never had anything to do with earning a Super Bowl ring, and he had one. Yeah. But I think about that, and then I think about the gifts that God has given us. Each of us here have a certain gift or 2 or 3, a package of gifts. And God gave them to you. You can't say, I earned this. Well, God works behind the scenes to allow you to be successful if you're successful. God has given you those gifts to do something with them. And if you don't, you're just like that putting it in your pocket. Taking the gifts God has given you and said, oh, well, I'm not going to do anything with these. I'm putting them in my pocket. You know, there's a verse, 1 Corinthians 4:7 says this. For who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you didn't receive? Everything we got, we received. And if you did receive it from God, why do you boast as though you did not? And so in a spirit of humility, my prayer is that we can give what's not ours back to him who made us.